Now let's apply to some of these and let me show you how they work. We want to look at early witnesses. So our earliest when it comes to Jesus would be the letters of Paul. And I don't have time to get into it tonight, but as I went in this morning's service, there are what are called oral traditions that are peppered throughout Paul's letters that we can identify, and these go much earlier than the letters of Paul themselves. But even just those letters are within, say, 20 to 35 years of Jesus' crucifixion. And there are certain things about there, like Jesus' death, his resurrection, his burial, the Last Supper, some of his teachings on marriage and divorce that go back even earlier, we know, in Paul's writings. And then the New Testament Gospels, as I mentioned, 50 to 100 years within Jesus. 50 to 100 or 20 to 70 years within the death of Jesus. And you say, well, why don't those other Gospels, why aren't they included in the New Testament? Like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary. Why don't we put those in there? Why don't we really consider what they have to say about Jesus? Well, because they weren't written until 150 to 300 AD, or 120 to 270 years after Jesus. You can see that when you've got something this early and then this late, you're going to prefer those things that are early. Now, a little bit earlier, I mentioned to you tonight that you have students, even those going to seminary, their biblical literacy is way, way down here today. Well, what's interesting is the sophistication of many biblical scholars on how to do history is down there as well, unfortunately. And what you'll have, they want to get away from the traditional Jesus. And so, and I'm not arguing tonight that everything in the Gospels is true. I'm just saying they do give us our best information on Jesus. In fact, the skeptic Bart Ehrman says if we want to know anything about the real Jesus, there's only one place to go, and that's the New Testament Gospels. So that's why we don't look at these others. And they present a radically different Jesus, kind of a laughable Jesus. The infancy Gospel of Thomas talks about how Jesus is working with his dad, Joseph the carpenter, one day, and Joseph cuts this piece of wood a little too short, this beam, and now he's like, oh, now I can't provide for my family for this one. We're going to lose money because I ruined this, and we're going to have to buy a new one that's going to eat up all the profits. And as he's really anxious over this, Jesus says, no problem, Pops. And he goes over to the plank and he pulls it to its proper length. No problem, no sweat, I'll take care of it. Or there's another time when Jesus makes some forms birds out of clay. By the way, this is reported in the Quran. So we can know that Muhammad had access to some really weird late Christian things. And that was one of his sources, not the Quran in heaven. But so he forms these birds out of clay. And then someone reports it to his dad, Joseph, and his dad comes and says, Jesus, what are you doing making those birds out of clay? This is the Sabbath. You can't do it. You're sinning. And before anything can happen, before his dad sees him like that, Jesus claps. When he sees his dad, he claps his hands, and the clay birds come to life and fly away. So now there's no evidence to convict him of working on the Sabbath. Another account is when some boys are making fun of Jesus, and so he curses them, and they just wither up and dry up and die. So we've got this really spoiled brat Jesus who's walking around doing these things. And then you have the Gospel of Philip. Now that was recently appealed to by these guys who talked about the family tomb of Jesus and said they found the burial remains of Jesus and his wife Mary Magdalene and his son Judah and so forth. Well, you say, well, where's their evidence that this was Mary Magdalene, his wife? Well, one of the bone boxes in there that said Jesus, son of Joseph, it said Mariamne Chimera. And he said, see, that meant Mary Magdalene, because Mary Magdalene is referred to as Mariamne. I'm thinking, well, where did that happen? I'm looking all through the New Testament. I can't find that name Mariamne anywhere in there. So then I find out, okay, what are they appealing to as their source for Mariamne being referred to as Mary Magdalene? and they go to the Gospel of Philip, which was written probably 2nd century or 3rd century. When you go to the Gospel of Philip and look it up, it's not Mariamne, it's Mariami. So it's a little bit different. Close enough, let's say, and let's just be generous to them and say, okay, you got Mariamne there, or Mariami. So, do we know that this is Mary Magdalene? And when you look through the Gospel of Philip, and you can read it, just Google it, and it will come up. You can read the Gospel of Philip. It never identifies her as Mary Magdalene. It identifies her as Mary, this Mariamne, the sister of Philip, the apostle. So we don't really have Mary Magdalene there, or we can't be certain. Could it be? Don't know. The Bible doesn't talk about her being the sister of anyone. So it might be, it might not be. Well, there's even more problem. It gets even funny now. Because she and Philip, her brother, are going around and telling people that when you convert to Christianity, if you're single, you can never get married. And if you're married, you've got to divorce your spouse and become single if you want to become a Christian. Because you can't have sex if you're a Christian. Now, here's the thing. Not only does the New Testament not teach that. In fact, the New Testament teaches marriage is good. But if Mary Magdalene, if this was Mary Magdalene, and if she was really married to Jesus, then why is she going around telling people they become Christians that they can't be married? And if they're married, they got to get divorced. After Jesus said you can't get divorced except for unfaithfulness. Was her marriage to Jesus that bad? I mean, what's the deal here? So you can see all kinds of problems you come up when you appeal these. Let me tell you, there are scholars who teach at Harvard. There are people with PhDs from Harvard and some Ivy League schools who say these Gospels present us with the real Jesus, not these. Now, when you do that, you're not being a responsible historian, are you? And in fact, you start to wonder, is there an agenda behind that? Do they have an agenda behind saying this Jesus, these Gospels give us more accurate information about Jesus than authentic sources? Josephus tells us a little about Jesus, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. You've got Pliny, the younger, who had been a governor and a soldier, an officer as well. And we've got a number of his letters that he wrote to the emperors, Roman emperors. And he mentions Jesus' execution. You've got Tacitus, as I mentioned him. He mentions Jesus' execution by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. You've got a lot of stuff that are mentioned by these unsympathetic sources that we can learn that corroborate much of what we have in the New Testament. Embarrassing reports. Now, as you look through the ancient Jewish literature, I did this study several years back, and to read about all the Jewish martyrs that happened before Christ and just within a little bit of time, a few hundred years afterward. And what's really interesting is you start to read through this, you start to see that this is a genre, a literary type. And you figure that probably some of these stories were doctored up in order to honor the martyr. For example, in the book of 2nd Maccabees, which is in that Jewish Apocrypha, the Old Testament Apocrypha that appears in the Catholic Bible between the Old Testament and New Testament, the Maccabean rebellion, 1st and 2nd Maccabees talks about, and this is what gave the Jews independence for a little bit before the Romans came in and conquered them. So they had independence for a few years from the Seleucid dynasty.